STEM City USA Healthy Doses series is your passport to a balanced lifestyle. Hosted by Dr. Tiffany Anderson and presented in the Boston Scientific Auditorium. And now, Dr. Tiffany Anderson.
Hey, good morning, everybody, and welcome to another special edition of Healthy Doses. My name is Rayondon Kennedy, and I will be your moderator for today's discussion. Now, I said today is special, and I mean that because we are live here at the Women of Color STEM Conference here in Detroit, Michigan, where there's been a bunch of amazing events taking place this weekend. If you want to visit, if you want to check out the conference, go ahead and go to womenofcolor.org. womenofcolor.net, and check out, register, and really check out some of these amazing events with some of these brilliant, bright, amazing women who are doing some amazing things in their fields. Now, let's get back to Healthy Doses. Healthy Doses is brought to you by Boston Scientific, and we are streaming live in the STEM City metaverse. This show was put together to give you the tools, the tips, and the advice that you need to just be the best person that you can be. And we do that by listening to our guide, our expert, our leader, Dr. Tiffany Anderson. Good morning, Doc.
Hey, Ray, how you feeling?
I'm feeling very good. It's been a good weekend so far, and looking to kind of finish strong.
There you go.
That yeah. Good. So, Dr. Anderson, yes. What is our topic for today?
Well, before I get into that, Ray, first I just want to start us off with a visualization to get us in the moment, to get us present, and to lead us into today's topic. Okay, so we're going to start. So I want you and the audience watching, I want you to take a moment, right, and think about something in your life that terrifies you in regards of anyone knowing, right? Think of something that if you believe that if anyone ever found out, right, that there will be repercussions, there will be some type of negative feedback, negative perception, right? Think about that thing that terrifies you and you're just simply afraid of anyone finding out. It could be a belief, it could be a personality trait, it could be a desire or some horrible failure in your life or in your past or something that you fear, whatever happened. Think about that moment. Think about whatever it is and just be present with the emotion that arises in your body when you think about it, right? Take a moment. Go inside your body. Be present with that emotion. Hold that emotion. When we return from our sponsors, Boston Scientific, we will pick up this conversation and discuss today's topic.
So somebody just cut the lights off on me here in this room. So I was trying to go turn it back on. And so, this is live TV. And these are these automatic lights. So I guess I got to move a little bit more to kind of keep it going. And so I'm sorry about that. But Dr. Anderson, before we left for the break, actually, before I get to that, if you want to join in the conversation, if you're relating to it, if you want to give us any questions, any feedback, there is a QR code in the top right hand corner of your browser. You can go ahead and click that. If you are on your cell phone and you can't use the camera on your phone to scan that, what you can do is click the link that's in the description of this video, or you can click the link that I will post in the chat in just a few. We'd love to hear from you. We'd love to participate with you, answer any questions that you have. Also, if you're in the STEM City Metaverse, there's a chat button. Feel free to comment there and communicate with everybody who's in the Metaverse watching right now. And so, Dr. Anderson, before we went to the break, there was you told us to visualize and kind of asked us to think of a memory. Memory came to my mind. It's not a good one. It's not pleasant. Something's up there. And so I'm curious as to what was the point? Why did we do that? What are we talking about today?
Why would I make you all feel comfortable?
I feel bad. Yes.
Including myself, because first of all, we all have those moments. We all have that thing. Most of us. And so today's topic is guilt and shame. And so if you felt any sort of guilt or shame when envisioning your idea, right, of what that terrifying thing would be, understand that this is the topic that we are talking about and that you are not alone. Like Ray said, something comes up for many of us, depending on where we store that memory, where we store our shame or our guilt, and how we're working through it, right? And so today we are going to be diving into those two topics that oftentimes, they're considered close cousins, and then we'll talk about what that means and why I put the two together, kind of hand in hand, kind of intermingle,
Yeah.
if you will.
Well, and actually, that was actually what I was about to say, because when you think about guilt and shame, a lot of time I think of them as being like synonymous. But you said they're cousins, so they're similar, but they're not. So to kind of clear that up for everybody, let's kind of define guilt versus shame.
Yeah, beautiful. So the way we understand guilt. So guilt is feeling remorse or responsible for something that we've done wrong or perceived to have done wrong, right? So it relates to a specific action, like making a mistake or committing an offense or hurting someone intentionally or unintentionally, right? So if I step on Ray's foot unintentionally, right, I could feel immediate guilt, or intentionally, I can feel immediate guilt, right? That says, okay, I feel remorseful. I did this action, and it's a specific action that I did, right? But I know that if I apologize or if I set out to never do it again, right? If I have an action plan for what I did, that we can kind of minimize that guilt or eradicate it completely, right? So that's guilt. It's around feeling remorseful or responsible for a specific action. Okay, now shame. Shame is feeling bad or worthy of contempt or feeling as if you're inadequate as a person, right? So it's relating to our behavior and to ourself, often in relation to how other people perceive us, others' opinions of us. So it's not necessarily about a behavior or event. It's about how we feel about ourselves as a whole. Does that make sense, Ray?
I think so. So while you was talking, I was thinking of some examples, and so let me know if I'm on the right track as far as identifying the difference between guilt and shame.
Yeah.
Now, I would never do this, but this was the example that pops to mind.
Yeah.
Say I run a stop sign,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I'm like, I shouldn't have done that. And I feel bad, but maybe I was in a rush.
Mm-hmm.
That's guilt.
Mm-hmm.
Shame would be me running that stop sign and going, "Oh my God, I'm a terrible person. I'm so bad. I'm ignoring these societal norms and if I run this stop sign, what other rules am I breaking or ignoring? And like that will be shame.
That's shame.
Got
That's
it.
that's a perfect example, right? Because
Mhm.
we make mistakes all the time, right? We may forget to call each other on each other's birthdays,
Mhm.
right? Um, we may forget to mail off a card. We may forget to cook dinner for our spouse. We right because of that action or that misaction, we can feel guilt after. I forgot to do this. Someone else is impacted by it, right? And I feel guilty for it. The way guilt works is that because if there's a behavior, a specific behavior, we can usually kind of attack that behavior in a way that says, okay, I can do things differently. Or I can call Ray and apologize for missing his birthday. I can apologize to my spouse and I can cook tomorrow, right? There's ways of like mediating that guilt. Shame is when you say, I'm a forgetful person. I'll never amount to anything. I'm unworthy of love. I'm unworthy of this connection with my friends. They'll never like me, right? Shame is like this internal dialogue of just unworthiness that goes beyond guilt. Yeah. And so why I put them together is because oftentimes when guilt is unchecked, it turns into shame.
Mm.
Makes sense. And so I forgot to call you on your birthday. Instead of calling, texting, checking in, I don't do anything, right? I start to then say, well, tired of Ray having birthdays. Every year he has a birthday, right? This is getting annoying. This is inconvenient, right? I start to make it about someone else, or I start to kind of demonize that person or the situation. And then it starts to turn into like a lack of responsibility, start to turn into distance in that relationship, right? Or I can tend to isolate from you simply from my guilt turning into shame and feeling as if you're the problem, I'm the problem, and there's no solution. And we see it all the time. And that's why in many relationships, when you find out, like, why don't you talk to your mother? Why don't you talk to your father? Like, what is the disconnect? Oftentimes we can find an action that turned into complete shame and disconnect, right? And now we haven't spoken for years. And that's how it works. And so that's why I put them together because it can change very quickly, and I see it happen all the time.
Yeah, guilt leads to shame. Let's dig a little bit deeper into that because we pick these topics because they're topics that if none checked or unnoticed or if we're ignorant to them, they really do impact our daily lives. And so the whole point about being the best person possible,
Mm.
let's talk a little bit more about why how these things affect our everyday lives and how they can disrupt so we can recognize them and then take actions to uh correct.
Yeah. So, in regards to just interrupting our daily lives, is when, and this is first in regards to kind of guilt, when an individual feels like emotional or mentally guilty, it ultimately affects their everyday habits, right? It can affect their behaviors, it can affect their relationships, their work duties, and generally just kind of like overall, because that feeling of guilt then impacts our affect, right? How we look, how we show up. It impacts our behaviors. Um, it impacts our relationships and how we then communicate with each other. And again, right, we're human. So I know we can think of times where something has happened in a relationship that we haven't addressed. And we call that the elephant in the room, right?
Mm,
That we haven't addressed, and that we are simply kind of coexisting, but not in the same frame or not in the same kind of connection that we once had, because it is that sense of guilt, because it is that elephant in the room that we haven't addressed. This happens every day, every minute, every moment. It happens in any relationship. It happens in the workplace. It happens via email, right? It happens in so many spaces. And we're constantly trying to figure out kind of how to navigate and maneuver these relationships and these hiccups, right? And so with guilt, it is that feeling of a certain behavior that I did, like I said, intentionally or unintentionally, and we're constantly trying to figure out if it can be rectified. And if so, what does that look like, right? So the encouragement in all of this is really to identify the behavior and see how you can mediate it as soon as possible, that so that it doesn't change into shame. Okay. When we look into um, shame, it's a transgression against the norm. You said a perfect word. You said societal norms earlier when speaking
Hmm.
about the stop sign. That
Hmm.
was perfect language. It is a transgression against societal norms. That's where shame comes from, right? And we'll dig more into that in a minute, right? But it's understanding societal norms. Number one, society does that very well with telling us what's normal and what's abnormal, right? So we have to understand societal norms to then know if our behavior is outside of that. Yeah. So that this individual may view a norm as desirable, and just and anything kind of acting outside of that can be considered a transgression and make that person feel very, very uncomfortable. Um, it's not even always like necessarily um, that the person or society is there to judge us. We don't even need that anymore, right? Because it's ingrained in us. So, like you said, stop sign, no one was in that car, correct?
Hmm.
No one said, Ray, this is bad. And yet you went to a place of shame. Does it make sense? It's
Yeah.
already ingrained in us to feel like that. Yeah.
So let's take a walk down this road a little bit. When
Mhm.
we're talking about societal norms and we're talking about shame and like the you said shame is kind of uh kind of like our thought process of feeling like we're bad people because we didn't do X, Y, Z. And so is it safe to say that shame is like based off of our own mind? Shame is something that we create in our own heads and kind of our perspective or what we think is right or what society thinks is right kind of
Mhm.
forms what we feel guilty about or what we feel because I might feel guilty about something, you might go through that stop sign and not think twice about it.
Mhm.
I know
Mhm.
how you drive, Dr. Anderson. You be flying. What stop sign? um, and so I guess what I'm getting at is, can we shape our minds? And we might cover this a little bit better, but like the way we think about things, you know, is
Mhm.
there a way that we perceive, maybe we might be blowing things out of proportion and maybe we kind of just need to refocus on what is actually kind of our values are important. Yeah, I might be talking in circles, but is that making sense as
Yeah.
far as like the source of shame and like what causes it?
Yeah. Um, so it's all of those things. It's all
Hmm.
of those things. What I can say is that we're not born shameful, right? So shame is definitely an emotion that um, is taught. It is the emotion that is just from the research that I was looking. It's the emotion that's like outside of our basic emotions, right? And
Hmm.
we'll dig more into that. But um, what it sounds like you were asking is like, okay, like if I'm actively working towards this, can I create like a paradigm in my mind that says, I don't have to respond in this way, right?
Hmm.
That's what it looks like when you are actively working and doing the work or know to do the work. So, yes, that is the goal. Um, is that what we are taught in society? No, we're not, because um, shame is a big part of shame and guilt in
Hmm.
society. It's a big part of how we cooperate as a society. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It is created for a reason out of societal norms that says, Ray, if I don't want you flying through each stop sign like you always do, right? There has to be some
Like you always do.
there has to be some innate awareness that says, no, do not do that, right? And so we get tickets. There's enough commercials and communal understanding that says this is wrong. You grew up with parents that said don't run through stop signs, right? So this is ingrained in us to feel an emotion around certain behaviors. Does that make sense? So this is society working and in teaching us what is right and what is wrong. And that is how shame has come about. And so, sure, we can start working on that. And that's a part of therapy. And, in other
Mhm.
words,
Which we'll get to. We don't have to dig
right,
in
which
now.
we'll
Yeah,
get to.
yeah.
But I think it's a great um, question because a lot of things we shouldn't be shameful about, though, right?
Mhm.
What we talk about with guilt and shame, we understand that guilt is around a behavior that we can mediate and work through, where shame is about our personhood and how we feel about ourselves. That's a bit more extreme and goes to what you were saying. Like, how does that work? How do we get to a place where we feel so negative about our selfhood, right? And just who we are as a person.
Yeah. And so you touched on something that was kind of sparking a question that I have now is, we're talking about guilt and shame, and we talk about it feels like it's like, a negative, right? But do you think that guilt and shame is necessary for a modern day society or a modern day civilization as far as having law and order, and people should have guilt and shame around certain things because otherwise we'll have anarchy or chaos or anything?
Mhm.
Like, what are your thoughts on that?
You always ask really great questions, right? That cause me to say, hmm. Um,
Or is it a necessary evil? I guess is a simple way to
right.
ask
That's a
that.
good question. And this is obviously subjective, right? Just my
Hmm.
opinion. Um, I'm not a huge fan of shame and guilt. I'm gonna be honest
Hmm.
with you. I'm not a
Yeah.
huge fan of it, probably because of the work I do
Right.
and uh, seeing how it has uh, so many detrimental effects on human behaviors and secrecy and silencing one's voice, right? And so I don't think um, it works in the way that society. No, that's not true. I think society. I think it works in the way society wanted it to work. Right? I think it
Hmm.
does keep us in check, whether someone's reprimanding us in the moment or not. I think it does a great job at keeping us cooperative and in check. But I do think there's better ways of communicating boundaries and limits, right? That doesn't cause the person to question their identity and their core beliefs and values. And so um, I think if we were to rewind, mm, we can do this thing called society a lot differently and still and still kind of create limits, like you said, in a society that is just a lot kinder to each other and to ourselves. Because what we're talking about with the guilt and shame, it's a personal attack on ourselves. Like I said, and it can be on others with certain actions, intentionally or unintentionally. But I want us to recognize that the actions haven't changed, that people still do things that may not be desirable. But I believe the way that we fix them and show up for each other is important. Um, but I don't know how effective this has been in regards to the overall well-being of humans.
Dr. Anderson, this has been a great conversation. I want to take a quick break just to hear from our partners, Boston Scientific. But when we return, I want to talk about um, how guilt and shame shows up in us physically. How can we see it? Does it show up physically, or is it just all in our head, like we kind of been talking about? And so let's take a quick break, and we'll be right back.
All right.
We know how to treat the colds and the coughs. We know how to treat the bumps and the bruises, the cuts and fractures. But how do we treat, I can't afford a day off work to see a doctor? How do we treat, I've never had a doctor who speaks my language? How do we treat, I don't know how to connect with some of my patients? How do we treat, You're not listening. We can't treat what we cannot see. So we have to look closer and see what we're missing. People, patients, misdiagnosed, misunderstood, overlooked. These are the people left out of a system charged with helping them. And it's up to us to find them in our communities, in our relationships, in our data. We're meeting them where they are, discovering who they are. We're taking an honest look to understand their healthcare needs and delivering effective ways to reach them. We don't have all the answers, but together we can find the way to address the gaps in our healthcare system, to provide something better, to find more chances to save more lives. It won't be easy, but we can help make it right, because no one should be missed.
Hey, welcome back, everybody. Thank you for joining us this Saturday morning as Dr. Tiffany Anderson and I have been discussing guilt and shame. We've been defining it. We've been talking about how it shows up in our everyday life, and we've been discussing if or isn't it a necessary evil. We would love to hear your thoughts on the topic. Do you think that guilt and shame are necessary for a modern day society or civilization? I would love to hear from you. Or if you have any other questions, be sure to scan that code in the top right hand corner of your screen to send us a message, or check the description of the show wherever you're watching it, and check the chat. Drop us a line. We would love to hear from you. Love to get your thoughts on the subject. Um, right now, Dr. Tiffany, as we're talking about how it shows up, how guilt and shame show up in our everyday lives, is there any physical, visible indicators that we might be aware of in case you have a family member, or in case you're, kind of self taking a look at yourself? Is there things that we see, or is there anything that's obviously, I guess, to the eye, or anything like that to identify someone who might be feeling that or going through a intense case of either guilt or shame?
Good question. Well, that's a great question. I also encourage the audience to think about a time where they felt guilt or shame, and think about how it manifested in their lives, because everyone's different. So some folks, you have no idea, right? Where they may have a great poker face, or where they may suppress or push down kind of these emotions, and they don't show it, right? So everyone looks differently, obviously, when it comes to kind of guilt and shame. Some of the kind of physical manifestations of guilt and shame could be, and this is a big one, nausea or upset stomach. I know that's a big one for me. um, Big one for me. Um, Upset stomach, when it's just like, oh, this doesn't feel good, right? Um, some folks can show up in their face where it's like flushing, or like a red tint, or blushing, right? For some, it may be sweating, or having the shakes, or tension inside their body. Anxiety, depression. It can show up as like panic or panic attacks, or shortness of breath. And I'm sure there's more. These are just a few. But the thing is, the ways in which it can manifest changes from person to person. Something that I see personally is distancing, isolating oneself because of it, deflection of responsibility, which is another manifestation, passive aggressiveness, right? Another manifestation of guilt and or shame, depending where that person is, right? And so this is just kind of new awarenesses that we need, that we can kind of avoid these things kind of manifesting in a way that we believe that we as a person are bad people, because we've allowed an action to turn into this kind of negative thought process of who we are, right? Just not which is ultimately for the most part not true. And as humans, society has done a great job at making us feel as if mistakes are not supposed to happen when they're inevitable, right? And again, things can happen intentionally or unintentionally that impact someone, right? Ray, are you familiar with the term impact versus um, um, impact versus? Ooh, I'm losing the word. Intent. Impact versus intent.
I know those words.
Okay. I say this because this is a good example of a way kind of guilt kind of happens, right? Um, for an example, I mean, even if we're using, I like the shoe. I like the shoe. Look, I like stepping on your foot. So if I step on your foot on accident, right, and I break your toe, that was my intent to step on your foot. What was my intent? Was it to step on your foot, right?
It was not.
There you go. What was
Yeah.
my impact?
You broke my foot.
Boom. Boom. So when folks say, I didn't mean to, that wasn't my intent, we have to recognize it's not intent. That's important. It's the impact.
It's the impact.
Yeah.
That's a
And
great
so,
example.
yeah. So I've been in situations, just being human, that have harmed, that have harmed. And I didn't know until it was brought to my attention, because my intent was not to harm anyone, but my impact was that they were harmed. So I still have to work through that harm. Does that make sense? I don't get to
Yes.
say, well, didn't mean to.
Yeah.
I don't. Okay, we recognize that, but someone is still harmed. And so a lot of times in society, we're running into that impact versus intent all the time, where folks are like, I didn't mean to, but someone is still in pain. And we have to address the person in pain, right?
Yeah.
So that's kind of how guilt works, where we can get so stuck in the intent. Well, I forgot, but I didn't mean to forget. And yet mom hasn't heard from you on her birthday. We need to work on that. We need to fix that. And guilt can allow us to do that, where it's like, okay, I can address this behavior. And we talked about shame, where shame is about the kind of intention of being, and guilt is the intention of doing, right? So behavior versus the person, it can get really kind of heavy.
There's a quote by Malcolm X that came to mind while you were talking, and I'm not sure if you're familiar, and I hope I don't butcher it too much. But there was where he was talking about the relationship between America and blacks. What he was saying is, you can't stab me with a knife
Mm.
and then pull it out halfway or pull it out all the way and say, oh, I'm sorry.
Yep.
Basically, what he's saying is you have to heal the wound from the impact. It's like, just you stabbed me, whether you meant to, whether it was your intent or not, it happened. This is there, and it left a mark, it left a wound. And so, or, it left an impact, if you will.
Yeah.
And you have to address that impact. Otherwise, it doesn't matter. Your sorries don't heal wounds. And so there has to be action taken. And so think about how that, applies to maybe your relationships or your interactions with people, because sometimes sorry is not enough. Sometimes you have to do the work to repair the wound. And I think that's kind of very powerful when we're talking about this subject. Dr. Anderson, I want to pivot a little bit, because we talked about it a little bit on why we experience guilt. And then when I think about it, it's like, is it because you said it was you say it was a secondary emotion or something? It wasn't part of our basic emotions, but animals kind of have guilt and shame. When I think about the term, running away with your tail between your legs, it's like a dog who's ashamed. They know they did something bad and they do it. And so it's not just a human instinct. And so I'm kind of trying to think about, like, what's the reason? There's obviously, especially when I think about animals and like the reactions, they have these reactions for a reason, right? There's an evolutionary whatever. And so I kind of want to talk about that. What are your thoughts on it being, a natural instinct, anything that might be passed down, maybe generational or learned behavior, if you will.
Yeah. It's it's interesting that you mentioned dogs because I am also a dog. I have a dog. I'm a dog mom. And um, I don't know if uh, my dog was in the wild, if they would have that same sense of shame and guilt. Think about
Good point.
it. Yeah, I think humans and them being domesticated animals, right? We teach them to be guilty and shameful for the behavior because there is a consequence for when they do things outside of our expectations. Makes sense.
Mhm.
And so it's interesting um, to think about the difference if he was a wild animal and you know pooped on someone's lawn, right? Would there be the same
Uh,
response?
It's a great example. I've never seen a wolf say sorry. Ooh,
Right,
sorry. Sorry,
right.
I ate you. Like,
Sorry. Yeah, like they live in their freedom. So, when you brought that up, it's like, ooh, we taught that.
guilt and
We
shame
taught.
is taught. It's taught. That's what we've been
Yeah,
saying.
that's what we're
Yeah.
talking about. So that's a good question. I'm gonna dive into it. So, um, with trying to understand this research about like, where it came from and all those things, um, what we kind of understand so far is that um, mm, so a lot of things, I'm smiling because this is I talk to my clients all the time. So many things, if not almost all things, start in childhood. So if you reflect back on your childhood and then you fast forward today, think about your relationship with your parents, right? You may recognize that you may have felt like you were a problem at times, or that your behavior was exhausting, or that they were just tired, and may have intentionally or not, remember we're talking about that, made you feel as if who you were was too much or not enough, or that you needed to perform or meet their expectations or show up in a certain way, right? Because again, we as humans operate in patterns. So if we are taught that certain behaviors should be condemned, should have consequences, then we ultimately raise our children in the same way. Does that make sense? And so, a lot of times when we're raising our children, especially um, folks of marginalized communities, right, where there's punitive consequences for certain behaviors, um, we may unintentionally raise them in a heavy kind of sense of shame and guilt to prevent them from doing certain behaviors, right? Prevent them from getting in trouble, or just getting into certain things that folks in the dominant culture can do and get away with because it is a part of our safety. And so I just say that because what we're seeing in the research and just in everyday life is that childhood is a big part of how one is instilled with a sense of guilt and shame. Okay. So just be aware of that. Childhood. It usually starts there, does not have to end there, but it usually starts there. All right. And then what we understand about kind of this natural instinct, right? So we all have basic human emotions. Those are innate. Everyone has them from day one, right? And then it's this understanding that then we have this cognitive realization that kind of gave rise called self-conscious emotions, right? So they're
Mm.
arguing that that is not what we're born with, that just living in society, right? Psychologists believe that as we gotten older, we took on this understanding of the subconscious or self-conscious emotion of shame, guilt, embarrassment, and pride. Yeah. Uh, this understanding is that this self-conscious emotions are emotions based on how we believe we are perceived by others and and how we are perceived by ourselves. Okay. Um, this emotion evolves in kind of like this subtle way, um, but it ultimately kind of turns into uh, this emotion helps individuals cooperate and live together in groups. They do a really good job at this. And so what you're asking is, how did it come about? Um, what does it look like? All of those things. Well, a 2-year-old doesn't necessarily have the self-conscious understanding or self-conscious emotion, right? So they may hit someone and move on, not feel anything, right? But a 5-year-old that has been living in society and rendered by their parents long enough, they hit someone, they may instantly feel that self-conscious emotion that's been instilled in them that says, "Ooh, I shouldn't have done that. That is bad." I give the person the toy back. I apologize. I move on. Right. So that is how we've kind of come into these additional emotions of guilt, shame, embarrassment, and pride through this idea of self-conscious emotions that we are not necessarily born with, but taught throughout the generations.
That makes so much sense. And
Mhm.
so, what happens when Dr. Tiffany Anderson runs through that stop sign and doesn't care? You know, do we need to send her someplace? No, I'm just joking. Uh, but honestly, when we're talking about the way guilt and shame kind of impacts our lives, when do we know? When should we seek professional help? Like, when is it a problem that we need to get addressed? And what are some of the treatment options, or what is that recovery look like?
Yeah, good question. And so, you know, again, guilt and shame looks very different from everyone. If we have a great kind of handle on our guilt, and we're able to immediately kind of rectify issues and things that we just do in everyday human interactions, we may not necessarily need to seek professional help. Uh, Shame is 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 again when you question your personhood, of not being worthy or needing contempt or demonizing who you are. That's generally when someone may seek therapy. So, right. So, uh, if you are thinking or saying or feeling as if you're not deserving of friendship or love, or if you feel like you're not enough, or you should be more, or you don't matter, or you can't do anything right, where you are having just heavy negative self talk and self doubt, and you can't seem to get out of it. I think that is a telltale sign that you um, may need to seek, professional help. And so that treatment looks like the therapist really helping the person to first identify these negative beliefs and acknowledge them so we can start to challenge them, right? Um, Rumination, these thoughts that go over and over and over and over. A lot of times we don't acknowledge them, they're just there. So a big part of that work is to acknowledge them and to begin to challenge them and find the source of where they're coming from, right? Negative beliefs that are rooted in shame can feel very powerful and very real for that individual. So we want to help them change these beliefs, uh, especially with consistent practice, grace, and self compassion, right? And teaching them a lot of what we're talking about today, right? Like teaching them the basics, teaching them where it started, uh, letting them understand that although they are a part of like keeping um, this kind of negative self-talk going, they may not have been the one that started it. And so allowing them to understand the root cause is very important. And then encourage them to acknowledge and make sense of it. Because a lot of times once we acknowledge our thoughts, it's like, oh, this doesn't really align with my truth. And I'm able to kind of identify that and slowly start rectifying each one that continuously comes up. So that's just honestly the beginning part. But acknowledge is a big part of treatment. Can't hear you, brother.
We're gonna do this every week, I see.
Yep.
Okay. So I lost my train of thought. The mute mic. Um, you just gave us some wonderful tips. You talked about acknowledge, like you just said.
Yeah.
What are some things that we could do? Maybe some tips that we can do ourselves in our everyday lives, so we don't get to the point where we got to come see. I feel like I'm taking clients away from you, but but what are some things that we can do to kind of do some daily maintenance on ourselves and kind of recognition to try to address these things before it becomes a problem?
Yeah. A big part is to learn to forgive yourself when you are human. So that just means everything, right? Learning to forgive yourself when you mess up, when you don't know any better, learning to forgive yourself when you do know better and you still fall into a common pattern that you once have, right? Our intention is to just be better every single day and to try. So we have to learn to forgive ourselves and to extend ourselves grace. I think that is a big one because if we can't even do that, it's hard for us to recognize when we should forgive others. It's hard for us to extend grace to others because we haven't done it for ourselves first, right? So that's a big one. We have to learn to forgive ourselves. Next, we have to have difficult conversations. A lot of times we heightened, and that's something I haven't seen about shame. Shame feels like a heightened exaggeration of the issue, right? Of your deficits, right? It just feels like there's a spotlight on you and everyone can see. That's what shame feels like. And so it's easy for us to avoid, not have difficult conversations. But I do encourage everyone, including myself, right, to have difficult conversations in the beginning as often as possible. So we don't get to a place where certain things turn into shame that don't need to, right? Okay, so have hard discussions, but it's okay. It's okay because I'd rather you have difficult discussions than have difficult discussions internally that are not your truth. Okay, redefine yourself. Redefine yourself as a person that is not uh, this negative person or a person that is worthy of being demonized, right? Redefine yourself as a person that is lovable, that is worthy, that is open to feedback, that is open to open communication and vulnerability, right? Redefine yourself. Next, surround yourself with people that value you and encourage you to have difficult conversations and allow you to come towards them, right? But to lean in, and that they allow you to be heard and that they receive your vulnerability, right? And so I think it's just really important for us to understand that uh, our own expectations sometimes of ourselves are not realistic. And that if we can redefine, right, and to create realistic expectations that are centered in love and self compassion, we can really start to redefine the relationships in our lives.
Dr. Anderson, this was great. Um, I know I'm gonna give you the last word, but I want to thank everybody for joining us. I know I have to cut out. I got to get back to this conference, but I hope that you join us next Saturday. I hope that you can check out the Women of Color Gala that's happening this evening. And so, if you want to check that out, go to womenofcolor.net. To register and kind of join us just to check out some of these amazing, brilliant minds that are here. I also thank you for joining us this Saturday and joining the conversation on guilt and shame. I hope this was able to help you. I mean, I think it was very powerful, at least as far as my end of it. And so I hope you guys have the same. Dr. Anderson, close us out.
All right. Thank you all again for joining us on this beautiful Saturday to discuss guilt and shame. One of the final messages that I just want to note is that negative feelings work against our overall recovery, right? Our overall well being. These negative emotions are not constructive and they will only kind of hinder our overall goal. Sometimes we feel as if saying negative things to ourselves are motivational, or saying negative things to others are motivational. They are not. They oftentimes keep us stuck, right? And so as we, you know, dive in and explore how guilt and shame has manifested itself in our lives, I want us to understand that we have also been taught these things, right? And so a lot of this is just relearning all over. A lot of our lives as adults will be relearning what we were taught. And so I encourage you all to relearn how you speak to yourself, to relearn that life is not about shaming yourself into doing, right? That it can be purposeful, it can be meaningful, and it can be seeped in self-compassion. So thank you all for joining us. Please come back next Saturday at 11 a.m. as we talk about family patterns and generational patterns and what that looks like in our lives. So thank you so much for joining us.
For more than 40 years, Boston Scientific has relied on our spirit of relentless innovation to advance science for life. We have the privilege and responsibility to deliver higher quality, less invasive, and more accessible device solutions, and the need has never been greater. Boston Scientific technologies are used to treat roughly 30 million patients around the world each year. Across our business, our products are supported by vast clinical data, including bench testing, randomized controlled trials, and ongoing real-world evidence to ensure the highest quality products make it into the hands of our customers. And we're always looking for ways to provide even more effective therapies and solutions. We invest over $1 billion annually in research and development to sustain a robust pipeline of meaningful innovations. We continuously strengthen our manufacturing and operations capabilities with artificial intelligence and advanced microelectronics to create devices that are smaller and smarter. And we're collaborating with our medical partners and physicians to advance digital capabilities with remote device support and a broad scope of training and education programs. Advancing science for life is also about supporting our employees and the communities in which we operate. Now more than ever, we rely on our values to guide our company as a global business and as a global corporate citizen. We're working to help confront healthcare inequities and social injustice, not only with financial contributions, but through volunteer service, advocacy, and expanding market accessibility. We're also focused on environmental initiatives that move us towards our goal of becoming carbon neutral by 2030. The unmet needs are great, but the future of healthcare is bright. Our innovation centers provide a place to explore opportunities, examine solutions, and see what lies ahead for medicine. Together, we can continue the relentless pursuit of innovation to help everyone live longer, healthier lives and make a difference all over the world.